All right, welcome to chapter 11. Technically, this is chapter 10 in your textbook, but sort of module 11 of the Chem 107 course. And this has to do with liquids and solids and a little bit of solutions. And the sort of main premise of this chapter is this notion of intermolecular forces. So the name intermolecular means between molecules. And so I've got this figure that I snagged from your textbook in chapter 10 here, and it sort of illustrates the general principle of what this entire chapter is about. We talked a lot in chapters 7 and 8 about intramolecular forces. So intramolecular means within a molecule, so the actual forces that hold together the bonds. And so when you're talking about, say, something like this is an intramolecular force that's holding the atoms of hydrogen and chlorine together to form the bond. But what happens when we have an HCl molecule? How does that interact with another HCl molecule and another HCl molecule at infinitum? And so that's where intermolecular forces come into play. So it's the interaction or the forces that relate molecules together. And so they're not actual bonds, they're just interactive forces. So the energies that intermolecular forces have are significantly less than those of intramolecular forces, things like covalent and ionic bonds that we've talked about before. And so the figure down here really illustrates how these intermolecular forces impact the physical states of matter that we're used to seeing. And so all the way to the left you have a solid form, in the middle you have the liquid form, and all the way to the right you have a gaseous form. All of the same exact substance. You could imagine maybe this is HCl, and we know sort of intuitively that as we increase the kinetic energy of these particles, really via the increase in temperature of the system, then what we're doing is imparting more energy to individual molecules, and we allow those molecules to vibrate and move and translate in space, and they translate between a solid where everything's locked in space to a liquid where there's a little bit more mobility between those molecules to a gas where there's essentially an infinite distance between those molecules in space. The intermolecular forces are the things that are operative here. The intermolecular forces are what are holding the molecules in a crystalline solid state or in a liquid state or in a gaseous state. So as we effectively increase the temperature from left to right in this picture, what we're doing is affecting the intermolecular forces that are holding these molecules in place. And there's a variety of flavors of intermolecular forces depending on the structure of the molecule. And so we need to dive into those. But before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about solutions, and then we'll jump into the specific flavors of intermolecular forces. So when we talk about solutions, I think we all have an intuitive idea of what a solution is. But a solution requires the definition of a couple key terms, one being the solute and the other being the solvent. So when we're talking about a solution, the solute is the object or the substance that's being dissolved. Usually that's in minority in terms of the overall composition of this system. So we'll say that the solute is red here, and so those are these particles here, and then the solvent is the thing that dominates the system. It's the one that's more abundant or in majority, and so it's the rest of the stuff that makes up this particular solution. So the blue is the solvent, it's the one that's in majority, the red is the solute. It's important to know, I think our intuition often points us to thinking about a solution being based in a liquid, often water, but really any state of matter can be part of a solution. You can have a liquid dissolved in a liquid, you can have a gas dissolved in a liquid, you can have a solid dissolved in a liquid. Any form of matter can be sort of swapped in or out for the solute and the solvent system. In this case, it's just the minor component and the major component that forms this definition of a solution. And so the intermolecular forces of the solute and the solvent are what dominate the ability for the solute to actually dissolve in the solvent. And so not only do intermolecular forces impact the physical state of the matter of a single substance, whether that's a solid, liquid, or gas, they also dictate whether or not, if you have two substances dissolving in another to form a solution, they dictate whether that's possible and to what extent. So how much of the solute can dissolve in the solvent. And this largely impacts things like solubility, which we talked a little bit about, but what you'll jump into more quantitatively in Chem 108. Okay, so intermolecular forces, how do we actually define these? I alluded to this a little bit before. So intermolecular is distinctly different from intra. Intra is what we've talked about extensively in this class. Those are the bonds that you form between atoms to form the molecule. Intermolecular forces are also known as van der Waals forces. This is sort of the classical term, so you may hear this from time to time. In this case, those are the forces that are actually holding molecules to in a molecule between molecule together. And those are purely electrostatic in interaction. And so when we were talking about intramolecular forces or bonds, we were talking about sort of the degree of sharing of electrons, whether that was a covalent, a polar covalent, or a purely ionic type of bond. Now we're talking about distinct molecules and how they interact with each other via this electrostatic or positive, negative, or Coulombic type force between molecules. So there's really three primary flavors of intermolecular forces or types of intermolecular forces. I'll talk about four, but one of them really is just a sub-example of the other. So the first one we'll talk about is the ion-dipole type interaction. So let's see. So with ion-dipole type forces, these are things that you're probably pretty familiar with. You just haven't heard this term before. But let's break it down. So you have an intermolecular force between an ion and the dipole moment of some other molecule, which implies if it has a dipole moment, then it must be polar. And so what we're really talking about is the picture that, that I have here, this cartoon, where you got an ion, and let's just imagine an ion that we actually know. So this is a negative ion or an anion. Let's imagine this is chloride. And you can see then that these sort of oblong shapes here, these oval shapes, those represent some polar molecule, something like water. And so you've got chloride dissolved in water. We know that water has sort of this polar structure where the oxygen, because it's more electronegative, becomes partially negative. The hydrogen is partially positive. And so the water molecules are going to orient themselves with the positive head of water so that it's sort of solvating or surrounding this negative chloride ion. And this is a purely electrostatic interaction, right? Negative and positive. And that's how the chloride ion becomes stabilized or dissolved as a solute in the water solvent. In this case, to the right, we have then the corresponding, say, sodium or potassium ion, where the water now is flipped in its orientation. We have that more partially negative oxygen, and it's interacting with the positive center of the sodium. And so an ion-dipole interaction is actually pretty moderate in strength. We consider this a moderate type intermolecular force because the energy associated with these types of forces are anywhere from 10 to 50 kilojoules per mole. So it's roughly about a fifth to a tenth that of a covalent bond. So just to give you some perspective, it's significantly less than a covalent bond. But in terms of intermolecular forces between molecules, it's fairly significant in the type of energy and the type of strength that this has, which is why we consider ion-dipole interactions a pretty significantly strong one. And part of the strength is derived from the fact that these ions are actually charged. It's not just the interaction of a dipole with a dipole, which is not truly a charge in a formal sense, but in this case it's a sort of weak dipole with a strong charge, and that interaction gives us this sort of moderate interaction in terms of its overall energy. Alright, so the second intermolecular force that I want to introduce is exactly what we just sort of alluded to. So in the first case we had an ion, which is charged, and the dipole of another non-charged molecule. And we said that was moderate strength, mostly because of the charged ion. But what happens if we replace that ion with just another neutral molecule? So in that case, we just have a dipole of one molecule interacting with the dipole of another molecule, both of which are neutral. But you can imagine then, if this is purely electrostatic, that's going to be significantly weaker than the ion-dipole interaction. That's exactly what we see. In the first case with ion-dipole, we said that was maybe energies around 10 to 50 kilojoules per mole, which was anywhere from a fifth to a tenth of the energy of a typical covalent bond, single bond. With dipole-dipole, we're much less than that. We're anywhere from 3 to 4 kilojoules per mole, and the picture that I have below sort of illustrates why that is. Because you have neutral compounds, and the interaction now comes simply from the partial positive and partial negative character rather than the actual positive or actual negative character of an ion. And so you can see that molecules of a solvent or of a solute in a solvent are going to align themselves such that the dipoles will interact positive and negative, and that's what the picture shows here, where we have this positive center aligned with the negative center aligned with the positive center, and that's how molecules will arrange themselves in a solution. And that's pretty neat to think about, right? Because when you have a solution of, say, water, or even a beaker of pure water, those molecules aren't just randomly oriented in space. They're oriented in such a way that it's going to lower the overall energy of the system by orienting the water such that the partial positive hydrogen atom is aligned with the partial negative oxygen atom, and that intermolecular force is what causes the water to actually be liquid water. If that force didn't exist to hold that molecule next to that molecule, well then those molecules would have no incentive to stay near each other, which means that this thing would just turn into a gas. And so that was sort of what I alluded to at the beginning of this video, is the intermolecular force is responsible for that interaction, which really dictates the physical state of matter. Right? If you have a stronger intermolecular force between molecules, there's a greater propensity for that thing to exist either as a liquid or even as a solid. As you raise the temperature of the system, those molecules start spinning and rotating and moving in space. You break that intermolecular force, and now you've just caused this thing to break apart and either fuse from a solid to a liquid or vaporize from a liquid to a gas. So just a quick example of what a dipole-dipole force might look like with a specific molecule. This could be something like chloroform. So I'm not drawing the actual molecular structure, but you can imagine this is like methane, except that one of the hydrogens has been swapped out with chlorine. We know that chlorine's more electronegative, which means that this thing's going to be a polar molecule. There's going to be more partial negative character on the chlorine and then more partial positive characters on the rest of the molecule. And so chloroform then would orient very similarly in solution to the picture that we have at the left. So the third flavor is actually kind of a sub-flavor. We're going to break it out as its own category just because it's so immensely important on this planet and in our sort of own biology as humans. It's the reason why we're alive. But it's really just an example of a dipole-dipole, a specific flavor of a dipole-dipole bond. So we'll call this 3, and we'll say these are hydrogen bonds, but really just know that a hydrogen bond is a specific type of a more general dipole-dipole interaction. And a hydrogen bond is a specific dipole-dipole interaction between molecules that have specific types of bonds, whether that's an oxygen bound with a hydrogen, a nitrogen bound with a hydrogen, or a fluorine bound with a hydrogen. So if any 3 of these bonds exists in the molecule, which is going to form a significant dipole just because of the significant difference in electronegativity between those 2 atoms, those dipole-dipole interactions amongst themselves, we're going to specifically call that a hydrogen bond. The reason why these are so important is because of the distinctly different electronegativities, this gives rise to a significantly larger bond strength, or force strength, I should say, not really a bond, of 10 to 40 kilojoules per mole. So notice, even though this is a dipole-dipole type of interaction, when it contains one of these three types of bonds or more than this, then this jumps from 3 to 4 kilojoules per mole up to 10 to 40 kilojoules per mole. So why is this so important? Well, it turns out that hydrogen bonds are really all of the types of bonds that dictate how proteins fold, how our DNA forms a double helix structure, how water interacts in our body. So they are hugely important to biochemical processes in all living things on this planet. And you can see that in the picture I have below. So water bound with water, that is a dipole-dipole interaction, but it's a hydrogen bond flavor of a dipole-dipole. This is why water is stable over such a long temperature range, anywhere from 0 to 100 C. That's crazy if you think about it. That's a huge window for a molecule to maintain a liquid state, and the reason for that is because this hydrogen bond between water is so strong, it resists temperature changes before it turns into a gas state. So the other reason why hydrogen bonds are so important is because it's why the planet Earth allows us to have liquid water over such a wide range. And if that weren't the case, if that weren't possible, then life would have never formed here. We also have ammonia over here, NH3. This is also a type of hydrogen bond. It's a little bit weaker because nitrogen is less electronegative than oxygen, but it's still pretty significant in how things or the range at which ammonia is. So I'll toss in here for good measure just a double helix structure. Couple pictures here. To the left we have the line bond structure, so each line dictates a bond and every vertex dictates an atom in that structure, and then to the right we have what's called the space filling model. So instead of the lines here we actually have spheres that represent those individual molecules, and you can see that every place where actually in the inside of the helix, you may have learned this in a high school biology class, or maybe you've taken a bio course or molecular bio course here. You know, our DNA is made up of these things called nitrogenous bases. They have these letters that represent the 4 in DNA, A, T, C, and G. That's adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. They form the inner part of the double helix, and you can see that every place in the inner part of the double helix there's a break right there. That break represents the hydrogen bond intermolecular force that actually holds each strand, single strand of DNA to form the double strand. So sort of running as a through line between this entire center of this double helix is a whole series of hydrogen bonds that form between adenine and thymine and cytosine and guanine. So without the hydrogen bond, the DNA structure would not be possible. Okay, so the fourth intermolecular force that we're going to talk about, the fourth and final, is this thing called London dispersion forces, and it's the strangest one to think about because everything we've talked about before has been really distinctly electrostatic, meaning you either have a standing dipole in a molecule, which is just the separation of electron density across the molecule, so you have partial positive, partial negative interacting with partial positive and partial negative of another molecule, or you actually have an ion, which is wholly charged and interacting with the dipole of another molecule. With London dispersion, it's a little bit different in that we're talking about nonpolar molecules, so that's weird. So how does a nonpolar molecule actually have an intermolecular force? So what I've got here is a picture of Br2 or bromine, and we know already from this class that if you have bromine bound to bromine, two identical atoms with a single covalent bond, then there's no difference in electronegativity, right? Delta electronegativity is 0, which means this is a nonpolar molecule. Okay, so that's true. It's nonpolar if we sort of think about it as a static molecule and a static bond, which is sort of how we represent it on the page of a paper, and that's how it's being represented in this picture here, where we can see the electron distribution from bromine to bromine as being the same. So here we have two bromine molecules, and the electron distribution is identical. That's represented by these sort of green surfaces. This is sort of time averaged, and by time averaged I mean if you imagine where the electrons are over a long period of time, then this is true. But if you were able to develop a camera, which we have as scientists, that allows us to sort of take snapshots at really, really, really small windows of time of bromine, what we actually see is that the electrons are moving back and forth across this molecule. And in effect, when you bring these two molecules together of bromine, the electron density on this side of the molecule actually distorts the electron density of a neighboring molecule in what we call an induced dipole. And the name induced dipole should sort of ring true here in that it doesn't have a standing dipole, right? We've already established that because it doesn't have a difference in electronegativity between the two atoms. But just simply bringing one negatively charged chunk of the molecule next to another causes a shift in that density for a very short window of time. And in doing so, that creates a very, very, very weak partially positive and partially negative portion of the molecule. So we have slight induced difference in electron density, and that creates an intermolecular force. It's weak, but it exists. And so we call this a really weak force, anywhere from 1 to 10 kilojoules per mole, typically on the lower end. But this type of force is still important, or this type of intermolecular force is still important because it describes how something like bromine, for instance, can be liquid at room temperature. Because again, right, the physical state is a function of how those molecules are interacting with each other, between each other, intermolecular. Bromine's a liquid, which is because of this type of interaction. I should also say that the larger the molecule is, then the easier it is to distort the electron cloud. And that should make sense because those electrons are further away from that positive nucleus, right? You've got a positive nucleus, say on iodine, and you've got these huge clouds. And so it's easier to shift these clouds around when they're further away from that positive nucleus. And so if we have chlorine, say we have actually the whole series of halogens, we have fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine. Iodine is actually going to be a lot easier to induce a dipole, which means actually iodine at room temperature is a solid, which is kind of crazy to think about. Bromine's a liquid. Chlorine is mostly a gas, although it's very near a liquid state. It doesn't take much pressure to induce it. And fluorine is definitely a gas. And so you can see this trend from gas to liquid to solid simply based on the size of these atoms and their propensity to have an induced dipole and undergo some sort of London dispersion molecular force.